There's a particular satisfaction in knowing you've built a life from the ground up. I'm Jack Miller, a name people know and a man who's carved out his own corner of the world. I grew up in a quiet town in Pennsylvania where nothing came easy, and I had to scratch and claw for every inch. By 40, I'd made it, but it hadn't been handed to me. Money, reputation, success, they were things I took for myself. And by then, people knew better than to cross me. I'd learned early on to look out for myself, to be the man who decided his own fate, and sometimes the fate of others too. Some folks might call me harsh, but I call it determination. The house I live in now, a sleek, modern fortress tucked into the hills of Boulder, Colorado, is proof of that journey. Every inch of it was something I'd imagined, planned, and paid for. And honestly, I thought my wife, Allison, was satisfied with it too. She liked the finer things, the best things, and I never denied her any of it. I built a world she could call home, a sanctuary of polished glass, expensive art, and a view most people could only dream about. But tonight, as I walked through the front door, there was a strange tension in the air. I could sense it the moment I stepped inside, like some heavy fog had rolled in and settled. When I saw her sitting on the edge of the couch, perfectly still, with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, I knew that this was going to be more than just a casual, late-night talk. Allison hadn't waited up for me in years. Allison's always been one to keep her cool. She's graceful, self-assured, with a quiet confidence that doesn't often slip. Her blonde hair was swept back in a loose knot, makeup light but carefully done, enhancing the intensity of her pale blue eyes. But tonight, there was something different. She seemed almost nervous, like there was something she wanted to hide but couldn't quite manage. She glanced up as I came in, her fingers twisting together as she swallowed and motioned for me to sit. "Jack," she started, her voice soft and steady, but her words came with a tension that belied her calm. "Allison," I said, leaning back in a casual way, hoping to ease whatever tension was hanging in the air. "What's going on?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the glass of wine in her hand before she looked up at me again. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Thinking about us." She paused, her eyes darting over my face, maybe looking for some sign that I understood what she was trying to say. But I didn't give her anything. I wanted her to say it, to get to the point without me having to pull it out of her. "I think I need a break," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I need some time, some space to figure things out." She waited, searching my face as if hoping for some reaction, a sign of understanding or maybe hurt. But I stayed silent, watching her fidget under my gaze. She'd come here to confess, but she didn't want to admit everything. She wanted a clean, easy exit, some understanding from me that would let her off the hook. What she didn't know was that I'd already picked up on the name she'd been muttering in her sleep, a name that wasn't mine. "Let me guess," I said calmly, my voice low, the edge in it unmistakable. "This is about Ryan, isn't it?" Her eyes went wide, fear and guilt flashing across her face before she could hide it. She opened her mouth to stammer out some kind of explanation, but I raised a hand to stop her. I didn't need her excuses. "It wasn't exactly hard to figure out, Allison," I said, shaking my head slightly. It was almost amusing how little she tried to cover her tracks, how she thought I'd just overlook it. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" She froze, the realization dawning on her that I knew. She'd been ready to spin some story, to try and justify it, but the truth was staring her in the face. "Jack, I don't know what to say," she managed, her voice shaking. He just made me feel alive again, like there's more to life than just." "Then this?" I interrupted, gesturing to the house around us, to everything I'd given her. "Then everything I've worked for? Everything we've built?" She looked away, shame briefly crossing her face before she nodded, clutching her wine glass like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "I just need to know if there's something more." She thought she was chasing something deeper, something real. She was here, asking for some space to explore it, to see if this new thrill was worth losing everything. But I didn't argue, and I didn't try to make her stay. She wanted to test her wings. I was more than willing to let her jump. If that's what you need, Allison, I said slowly, each word carefully measured, then take all the time you want. Her surprise was clear. She'd expected me to fight, to plead, maybe even to get angry. But I didn't give her that satisfaction. Thank you, she said quietly, looking relieved as a small smile appeared, as if she'd been granted permission to go live this fantasy of hers. I wasn't sure you'd understand. One thing, I added, leaning forward so my voice was a low, icy whisper. Sometimes, freedom isn't what it seems, Allison. She blinked, confusion flashing in her eyes, but she quickly pushed it aside, giving me a small, dismissive nod before standing up. With a look of newfound determination, she picked up the suitcase she'd left by the door. She paused just once, glancing back at the life she was leaving, before heading toward the door, her heels echoing on the marble floor as she walked away. I waited until I heard the front door close behind her, letting the silence settle around me like a heavy cloak. She thought she was getting her escape, her chance to find something more. But she'd learn soon enough. I took out my phone, a slight grin pulling at the corner of my mouth as I found the contact I'd been saving for this very moment. Ryan Cross. I'd already done my research on him, his life laid out like an open book. A struggling artist, a guy scraping by on part-time gigs and dreams that were bigger than he'd ever achieve. All it would take was a few calls, some careful nudges, and I'd hand him everything he thought he wanted. It wouldn't take long before the pressure of success ate him alive, and I'd be there to watch every crack form. With that thought, I poured myself a drink, the soft clinking of the glass filling the silence. I lifted it in a private toast to my wife's new freedom, knowing that every step she took in this so-called new life would lead her right back into my plan. She wanted freedom? I'd give her a taste of it, the kind that would leave her begging for the stability she'd left behind. The morning after Allison walked out with her suitcase, I wasted no time setting my plan in motion. I knew this had to be precise, each step carefully laid out if I wanted her to see just how far her choices would take her, and how little control she really had. I made 3 calls. The first was to my financial director. I had a specific arrangement in mind, a way to channel some of my funds through a quiet, indirect path. That money would end up behind Ryan's big break, though he'd never know it was me fueling his sudden success. He was in for a whirlwind, believing that fate was finally rewarding his talent. He'd think the universe was suddenly on his side, not realizing that every dollar he was about to make came from me. And when he was at the peak, I'd make sure it all came crashing down. The second call was to a guy named Mark Dixon. "Jack," he answered, his voice sharp, businesslike, always eager to take on a new project. "Mark," I replied with a grin, "I've got a new musician for you. Name's Ryan Cross. Local guy, struggling, but hungry." He laughed, catching on immediately. "You want me to put him through the ringer?" "Exactly. You know the type. Got a little talent. Thinks he's meant for something big. I want him booked solid. Every late-night show, every interview. Anything that'll make him feel like he's one step away from the top. Keep him running. Make sure he feels like he's about to make it, but never quite gets there." "Oh, I can handle that," he chuckled darkly. "I'll push him until he's barely keeping up. Give him just enough to make him believe he's about to be famous." "Perfect," I replied, feeling the satisfaction of the plan taking shape. "But don't let him get too comfortable. Double book him. Overload his schedule. Make sure he doesn't have a spare moment to himself." "Got it," Mark replied, his voice gleeful. "I'll make sure he's spinning in circles before he knows what hit him." With Mark on the case, I knew Ryan would be busy, constantly chasing that illusion of fame. And I knew exactly what that would mean for Allison. She thought she was walking into a world of freedom, but what she'd find instead was a man too absorbed in his own ambitions to remember she existed. The third call I made was to Claire Walsh. Now, Claire was someone who understood strategy better than anyone else I'd ever worked with. A savvy consultant, she was sharp, perceptive, and unyielding. I'd known her for years, even brought her along to a few of those high-profile events Allison used to love. If anyone could help me craft the public message I wanted to send, it was her. "Jack," she answered, her voice warm but professional. "It's been a while. How can I help?" "Claire, I need you to make yourself available," I said, getting straight to the point. Allison's left. She thinks she's found something better, some kind of freedom. She laughed softly, understanding immediately. So, you want to show her what she left behind? Exactly. I need you to step in, attend events with me, be seen around town. Let people start talking. Let Allison see what she gave up. She paused, amusement evident in her tone. Close enough for her to notice, then? Close enough for everyone to notice, I replied firmly. I want her to understand the reality of what she's lost. Understood, she replied smoothly. I'll clear my schedule. With that final call, my plan was complete. Allison would walk into a world I'd constructed from start to finish. She'd see Ryan on the rise, her artist, slowly slipping further from her with each success. And she'd look back to see Claire by my side, a reminder of the life she'd tossed away. The first updates from Mark started coming in almost immediately. He had Ryan booked solid, every small club in town, every radio show that would take him. He was being pulled in so many directions that he hardly had time to breathe, let alone devote himself to anyone. And yet, from what Mark told me, he was thrilled. He thought he'd finally caught a break. The fool was telling everyone who'd listened that he was about to go big, completely unaware that his newfound success had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with my plans. I received a message from Mark later that evening. Ryan's schedule is packed. Allison's showing up to every gig, but he barely has time for her. He's too focused on keeping up with the demands. I could picture it clearly. Allison, once so confident and secure, now hanging around the back of some dingy club, waiting for Ryan to throw her a glance, a word, while he barely registered her presence. She'd wanted excitement, and she'd found it. But the thrill wasn't quite as romantic when she was alone, watching her soulmate, exhausted and distracted. A few nights later, Mark called with an unexpected development. "Jack, thought you'd want to know," he said, a satisfied edge to his voice. "Your boy Ryan's been finding other interests." I sat up, my attention peaked. "Go on." "Seems women have been paying him attention, and he's not exactly turning them down," he said with a laugh. Last night, he left the club with a new face on his arm. No sign of Allison. I let out a short, amused breath. Good. Keep giving him those opportunities. Make sure he's living his dream. "Consider it done," Mark replied, his laughter fading as he ended the call. Ryan was slipping further into the fantasy life he'd always craved, and Allison was watching her true love become someone she barely recognized. She thought she was breaking free, but all she'd done was trade one cage for another. And every day, I let her see it from a distance, knowing she was more of a stranger in that world than she'd ever expected. Then, one evening, my phone lit up with a message from Allison herself. "Jack, I was hoping we could talk sometime. Just for a bit?" I let the message sit unread for a few hours, letting her wonder if I'd even respond. When I finally did, it was almost midnight. "Busy this week. Maybe another time." Her reply came almost instantly, a faint plea hidden in her words. "Of course, but if you're free soon, I'd really appreciate it." I left her on read. While she waited for an answer that wouldn't come, Claire and I made appearances together all over Boulder. At a charity gala that weekend, we arrived arm in arm. I knew this would make an impression. People were already starting to talk. The whispers and glances weren't lost on either of us. Claire was dressed in an elegant, dark green dress, and we both knew that anyone watching would make assumptions. Allison would hear about it soon enough. As we walked in, Claire leaned close, her smile knowing. "You're making quite the statement, Jack," she murmured, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Just letting her see what she left behind," I replied, feeling the cool satisfaction settle in. "She'll notice," Claire replied, raising her glass to me in a private toast. Here's to moving on. Days passed, and Mark continued to send updates on Ryan's downward spiral. The man was barely holding it together. He'd started missing gigs, forgetting commitments, and showing up late. Mark confirmed that he was still seeing other women on the side. Allison was no longer enough of a priority, and she knew it. The fantasy she'd chased was unraveling, but I wasn't finished yet. A week later, she sent me another message. "Jack, I know I don't deserve it, but please, can we talk? Just once." I read it and waited another day to respond, letting her think about it. When I finally replied, my words were brief. Come to my office tomorrow at 5 p.m. We'll talk. I didn't plan on making this easy for her. I wanted her to feel the consequences of every decision she'd made, every choice that had led her to this point. The next day, as the clock ticked toward 5, I sat in my office, the space quiet and empty, all my staff gone for the day. I wanted this meeting private, just me and Allison, face to face, with nothing to distract her from the reality of her situation. At 5 sharp, I heard the elevator doors open, followed by the click of her heels against the floor. She stepped into the office, looking around uncertainly, her gaze landing on me with a mix of regret and something close to desperation. She looked tired, worn down, as though the life she thought she wanted had taken more from her than she'd expected. "Jack," she began, her voice soft, almost pleading. "Thank you for meeting with me." I didn't respond immediately, letting her sit with the silence. She shifted, her fingers twisting in her lap as she waited for me to say something. I knew she was feeling the weight of it, the discomfort of seeing me here, unmoved, while she felt so fragile. "Sit down," I said finally, my tone cool and controlled. She obeyed, lowering herself. As Allison lowered herself into the chair across from me, her hands shook ever so slightly. She didn't look like the composed woman who had walked out of our house, suitcase in hand, a few weeks earlier. Her once proud confidence had faded, replaced with a nervous energy she couldn't quite hide. She looked worn down, maybe realizing that the life she'd chosen wasn't the fairy tale she'd imagined. "Thank you," she said softly, barely able to meet my eyes. "Thank you for meeting with me." I let her words hang in the silence, giving her nothing. She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twisting around each other as she waited. I could tell she was struggling to find the right words, to say what she'd come here to say. "Jack," she began, her voice breaking slightly, "I know I don't have any right to ask for forgiveness. I know what I did was unforgivable." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I miss us. I miss the life we had together." I watched her without a hint of sympathy. "The life you chose to walk away from," I replied, my tone cold, detached. She flinched, but she didn't look away. "I was wrong. I thought. I thought I wanted something different, something more. But it wasn't real. I see that now." The remorse in her voice might have swayed me once, but not anymore. She'd made her decision, and I had no intention of letting her off the hook so easily. "Something more?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You traded our life, everything we built together, for what? A fantasy? A freedom that lasted all of 5 minutes?" She winced again, and I could see the shame washing over her. "I know it sounds ridiculous, and I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I just needed you to know that I'm sorry, that I realize what I've done. I just want to fix it." I leaned forward, letting her see the cold resolve in my eyes. "Fix it? You think it's that simple?" She lowered her head, her shoulders sagging as the weight of her mistakes pressed down on her. "No," she whispered. I wish things were different." I almost felt a hint of pity for her, sitting there, looking broken and regretful. But I remembered all too clearly the way she'd walked out, that triumphant look on her face as she'd reached for her so-called freedom. She hadn't expected to be back here, sitting in front of me, hoping for a second chance. And I wanted her to feel every bit of that regret. "I'm seeing someone else, Allison," I said finally, my voice even, emotionless. She froze, her eyes widening in shock. "Someone else?" "Yes." I leaned back, my expression unreadable. "Someone who was there when you left. Someone who knows the meaning of loyalty. Unlike you." She stared at me, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "But Jack?" "Elena," I said, letting her name drop like a stone into the silence. "She's been by my side through all of this. She's been there when you weren't. And now? She's in the spot you used to hold." Allison looked away, her face crumbling as the realization hit her. The life she'd left was gone, and there was no way back. Her shoulders slumped, the desperation in her eyes fading to something hollow, broken. "So, that's it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. It's over? It was over the day you walked out, I replied, my tone flat, final. You made your choice, and now you get to live with it. She sat in silence, staring at the floor, her hands trembling. She'd come here with some faint hope, thinking maybe she could find a way back, a chance to return to the life she'd thrown away. But all she'd found was the cold reality of her own choices. I stood, signaling the end of our conversation. Goodbye, Allison, and don't expect to hear from me again. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the office, leaving her in the empty silence of her own regret. Allison's attempt to regain her place in my life had ended as I'd planned, with her realizing just how thoroughly she'd lost everything she'd once taken for granted. A week later, my lawyer handed me the final divorce papers, and I signed them without hesitation. This was the final act, the last piece in the puzzle I'd been putting together since the day she left. Make sure these reach her tomorrow, I told my lawyer, my voice calm, detached. He nodded, understanding the significance. Of course, Mr. Miller. I'll take care of it. With a simple signature, Allison was officially out of my life. That weekend, I went with Elena to a business dinner at a high-end restaurant in Denver. As we finished our meal, I received a message from my lawyer confirming that Allison had received the papers. I could imagine her expression as she opened them, the finality of it settling over her. She'd know then that there was no coming back, no way to recover the life she'd so carelessly thrown away. Elena noticed my expression and leaned over, her gaze curious but gentle. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, the weight of the past few months lifting in a way I hadn't expected. "Yes," I replied, feeling a deep sense of closure. "It's over. The divorce is final." Elena raised her glass with a small smile, her eyes warm. "Here's to a clean start, then." "To new beginnings," I replied, clinking my glass with hers, feeling the satisfaction of moving forward. The days that followed were quieter, lighter. Elena and I fell into a natural rhythm, attending events together, making plans that didn't involve the weight of the past. I found a new sense of freedom in the life I'd created, one that wasn't about control or revenge, but about finally letting go. Then, a few weeks later, I received one last update from Mark about Ryan. "Jack," he said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Your boy Ryan finally hit bottom. He's back in his hometown, trying to rebuild himself, as he puts it." I let out a short laugh. "And Allison? She's been keeping a low profile. She's having a hard time fitting back into the social circle she left," Mark replied, clearly enjoying the poetic justice. "Seems like she's struggling to find her footing again." "Good," I replied, feeling a cold satisfaction settle in. "Let her figure it out." I hung up, feeling that dark satisfaction of seeing the consequences unfold as I'd planned. Allison had traded everything for a fleeting fantasy, and now she was left with nothing. No dream, no love, no escape. She tried to find herself in a life I controlled from the start, and now she was living with the reality of those choices. With Allison gone and the divorce final, my life took on a certain clarity I hadn't felt in years. The chapter with her was closed, and I was free to move forward without looking back. There was no longer a shadow of regret, no lingering bitterness, just a sense of calm. Elena and I began appearing together at more events. It felt natural, not forced or strategic, and there was an ease to our time together. She knew about Allison, knew about everything I'd gone through, and she didn't pry or try to offer advice. She was just there, sharing in the present without trying to fix the past. One night, as we were heading back to her car after a long evening, she glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. "You seem different these days," she said, her tone soft, casual. I shrugged. "I guess I finally feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be." She smiled, understanding without me having to say much more. "You've found peace. Not everyone gets that." Maybe she was right. I'd learned more about myself in the past few months than I had in years, and it was liberating to no longer be tied down by Allison's decisions or my need for control. Now, life was something I could embrace, not something I had to orchestrate. A few days later, I received one last message from Allison. "Jack, I know I shouldn't be contacting you, but I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for everything. I realize now how much I threw away, how much you meant to me. I know it's too late, but I hope someday you can forgive me." I read her message, but I didn't feel anger or sadness, just a detached acceptance. She was finally facing the consequences, acknowledging the reality she'd created. I didn't reply, didn't feel the need to respond. This was her path now, and I was done being a part of it. Instead, I focused on the life ahead of me. I poured my energy into new projects, investments that excited me, ventures that took me to places I'd never thought I'd explore. I started spending weekends hiking with friends, rediscovering parts of Boulder and Colorado that I'd once taken for granted. It was freeing, exhilarating even, to feel like I was finally living without the burden of someone else's choices weighing me down. Elena and I grew closer, and though we didn't rush into anything serious, there was an undeniable connection that felt steady and real. She became a confidant, someone who understood me on a level that went beyond appearances or social expectations. With her, I didn't have to be the man with all the answers or the ruthless businessman everyone feared. I could just be Jack, with all the flaws and complications that came with it. On a quiet evening a few weeks later, we sat together on the patio of a cozy little restaurant overlooking the city. Elena raised her glass, a small smile playing on her lips. "To clean slates," she said softly, her gaze steady, open. "To clean slates," I echoed, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the wine. I had a new beginning, a life that was truly mine to shape without the baggage of the past. And as I looked out over the lights of Boulder, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. In the weeks that followed, life felt lighter, as if a weight had lifted that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. With the end of the chapter with Allison, I found myself redefining what mattered. The world I'd worked so hard to build was still here, but I was seeing it with new eyes, free from the bitterness and resentment that had once clouded everything. My work continued as it always had, but now there was a new balance. I took on projects that genuinely interested me, investments that felt like fresh challenges rather than obligations. I spent less time micromanaging every detail and more time trusting the people around me, giving them the chance to prove themselves, to contribute to something larger. It wasn't just about control anymore. It was about creating something meaningful, something I could look back on with pride. Elena became an even more significant part of my life. Our bond grew naturally, without the need for pretense or expectation. She understood the journey I'd been on, the scars and the lessons I carried, and she didn't try to change me. We enjoyed our time together, whether it was a quiet evening at home, a weekend getaway to explore the mountains, or just sharing a coffee in the early morning light. There was a simplicity to it, a genuine connection that needed no grand gestures or promises. It was enough to be present, to be seen for who I truly was. Every now and then, I'd hear updates about Allison through mutual friends or the occasional gossip, but they didn't affect me. I no longer felt the need to control the narrative or shape her life from a distance. She was on her path, whatever that looked like now, and I was on mine. The bitterness had faded, replaced with a kind of peace, a quiet acceptance that this was how it was meant to be. One evening, Elena and I attended a charity event together in Denver. As we walked into the venue, I realized how natural it felt to be there with her, how comfortable and right it seemed. She fit into my life seamlessly, without needing to adapt or change for anyone. We spent the evening laughing, talking with friends and colleagues, and as I looked at her, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging, of gratitude for the life I had now. At one point in the evening, she turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what you'd say to her if you ran into her again?" she asked gently, her gaze searching mine. I thought about the things I'd once wanted to say, the anger and betrayal I'd held on to. But now, I felt only a calm acceptance. "I think I just wish her well," I replied, surprising even myself with the truth of it. "We're different people now. What's done is done." Elena nodded, a soft smile on her face. "You've grown more than you realize, Jack." I returned her smile, feeling a warmth spread through me. She was right. I'd let go of the need for revenge, the obsession with control. I'd found a life that was truly my own, a freedom that wasn't about trapping someone else but about releasing myself. As the evening wound down, we stepped outside, the cool night air refreshing after the warmth of the crowded event. We stood together, looking out over the city lights, feeling the quiet peace of the moment. "To new beginnings," I said softly, my voice carrying a deep sense of gratitude. "To a future worth living," Elena replied, taking my hand in hers. And as we stood there, side by side, I realized that this was all I needed. A life built not on power or control, but on connection, trust, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd found something real. The past was behind me, a part of the story that had led me here but no longer defined me. I was free, truly free, to embrace this new chapter, and I knew, deep down, that the best was yet to come. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.